People ask me all the time why I sold everything I owned and moved to the Philippines. Most of them assume it was because I wanted a cheaper place to retire. Some think I was running away from life in America. Others assume I met someone online and completely lost my mind. I understand why people think that. If someone had told me 5 years ago that I'd eventually sell my house, my truck, and almost everything I'd spent a lifetime collecting just to move halfway around the world, I probably would have laughed too. The truth is, none of those guesses are completely right. 5 years ago, if you'd asked me whether I'd ever leave America, I would have laughed. Not because I hated the idea, because my entire life was there. My family, my memories, my routines, everything I'd spent decades building. At that point, moving halfway around the world wasn't even a thought. Finding someone to spend the rest of my life with felt far more unlikely. For almost 8 years, I had been single. I wasn't angry about it. My days had simply settled into a routine. I'd meet someone every now and then, go out for coffee, maybe dinner, but nothing ever seemed to grow into something lasting. Eventually, I stopped chasing the idea quite so hard. At my age, peace started feeling more important than excitement. I wanted someone who appreciated the little things, someone honest, someone who didn't need constant entertainment just to be happy. After a while, I honestly started believing that chapter of my life had already been written. Then one evening, while wasting time scrolling through Facebook, I noticed a comment. It wasn't anything special, just a funny reply underneath a travel photo. For reasons I still can't explain, I answered it. She answered back. That was it. Nothing romantic, nothing dramatic, just two strangers talking. What started as a simple conversation slowly became part of my everyday routine. We'd send a few messages, then we'd start talking on video. Some nights we'd talk for 20 minutes. Other nights we'd look at the clock and realize 3 hours had disappeared. There wasn't anything extraordinary about those conversations. That's exactly why they mattered. She was exactly the same person every single day. Honest, kind, easy to talk to. One afternoon, I caught myself checking the time because I knew she'd be getting home soon. That's when I realized I wasn't just enjoying our conversations anymore. I was quietly building my day around them. It was exciting. It was confusing. And if I'm being honest, it scared me a little. Because no matter how close we'd become, there was still one thing we hadn't done. We had never met in person. Looking back, that was probably the biggest gamble I'd ever taken. I just didn't know it yet. The hardest part wasn't getting to know each other. It was wondering whether everything we'd built through a phone would still be there when we finally met. So we waited, saved money, worked around schedules, and nearly another year passed before we finally booked the trip. I wanted to do it right. The closer the trip got, the more nervous I became. Not because I was afraid of the Philippines. I was afraid that maybe we built something online that couldn't survive in the real world. I'd heard the stories, people pretending to be someone they weren't, relationships falling apart after the first meeting. I won't lie, those thoughts crossed my mind more than once. I probably packed and repacked my suitcase 5 different times. I checked my passport so often I started laughing at myself. My daughter even asked me one afternoon, Dad, are you sure about this? I smiled and told her, No, but I'm sure I'll regret it if I never find out. 20 hours of flying gives you a lot of time to think. Somewhere over the Pacific, I remember staring out the airplane window, wondering if I was making the biggest mistake of my life or the best decision I'd made in years. I honestly had no idea which one it would be. When the plane finally landed, everything suddenly became real. The heat hit me the moment the airport doors opened. People were everywhere, families hugging, drivers holding signs, children laughing. My heart was beating so hard I could actually hear it. And then I saw her. She smiled. I smiled. For a few seconds, neither of us moved. After nearly 2 years of talking through a phone screen, there we were, standing only a few feet apart. I wish I could tell you I walked over and swept her off her feet like something out of a movie. I didn't. I think I said, "Hi." She laughed. Then she hugged me. And somehow, every bit of nervousness I'd carried halfway around the world disappeared. What surprised me most wasn't that she looked exactly like the woman I'd been talking to for all that time. It was that she felt exactly like the woman I'd gotten to know. There was no pretending, no awkward introductions, no trying to impress each other. It honestly felt like I was meeting up with someone I'd known for years, because in many ways, I already had. The next 2 weeks weren't filled with expensive vacations or luxury resorts. That's never really interested either of us. Instead, we did normal things. We drank coffee together in the morning, went grocery shopping, cooked dinner, walked through neighborhoods, met her family, sat outside in the evenings listening to the sounds of people living their everyday lives. It may not sound exciting, but somewhere during those 2 weeks, that's when it clicked. I wasn't falling in love with a vacation. I wasn't falling in love with a vacation. I was falling in love with a life. At the time, I didn't understand why that mattered. A few months later, I would. The hardest part wasn't arriving in the Philippines. It was boarding the plane home. For the first time in a very long time, I wasn't looking forward to getting back to my own house. I was already wondering when I'd see her again. The first week back home was harder than I expected. For nearly 2 years, my phone had been how we stayed connected. Now, it felt like the only thing separating us. We slipped right back into our routine. Morning messages, video calls, sending each other pictures of what we were doing. Sometimes we'd cook dinner together while the phone sat propped up on the counter. She'd be making dinner there, I'd be making dinner here. 8,000 miles apart, but somehow sharing the same evening. Looking back, those little moments meant more than any fancy vacation ever could. A few months later, I went back. This time, I stayed longer. There wasn't a schedule, no list of tourist attractions. I'd already seen the places most visitors wanted to see. This trip was different. I wanted to see what everyday living actually looked like. I'd wake up early, sometimes before she did. I'd make coffee, sit outside while the neighborhood slowly came to life. I'd hear roosters in the distance, kids getting ready for school, someone already sweeping their front yard before the sun was fully up. It felt peaceful. Not because everything was perfect, because everything seemed to slow down just enough to notice it. I met more of her family, shared meals around the table, laughed at conversations I only understood half of. Her nieces and nephews quickly decided I was supposed to play with them every afternoon. I didn't have much say in the matter. I learned that family wasn't something reserved for birthdays or holidays. That's just how people lived. People stopping by without calling first. Someone always asking if I'd eaten. Neighbors waving as they walked past. It reminded me of the way my hometown used to feel decades ago. One evening, while we were sitting outside after dinner, she asked me something that caught me completely off guard. What do you think our future looks like? It was a simple question, but I realized I didn't have an answer. Not because I didn't want one, because I honestly hadn't allowed myself to think that far ahead. When I flew back to America after that trip, we both knew our relationship had become something much bigger than weekend video calls. We weren't wondering if we loved each other anymore. We were wondering how we were ever going to build a future together. I couldn't stop thinking about that question. Like most couples, we started looking at our options. The fiancé visa seemed like the most logical path. So we gathered information, started putting paperwork together, and told ourselves we just have to be patient. Neither of us expected everything to happen overnight. We knew international relationships took time. And honestly, the paperwork wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me was realizing that every month we spent waiting was another month of living separate lives, another birthday apart, another Christmas through a phone screen, another regular Tuesday wishing I was somewhere else. One night, after we ended another video call, I sat there staring at the empty chair across from my kitchen table. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet you only notice when there's nobody left to talk to. And I caught myself thinking something I hadn't admitted out loud before. I was spending all of my energy trying to bring her into a life that I wasn't even sure I wanted anymore. About 8 months later, I found myself boarding another flight to the Philippines. By then, I didn't need to check maps anymore. I already knew which terminal to walk toward. I knew which snacks I'd buy before boarding. I even recognized a few of the flight attendants who smiled and asked, "Vacation again?" I smiled back. Something like that. By the third trip, I wasn't arriving as a visitor anymore. I already knew where the grocery store was. I knew which bakery she liked. The woman behind the small coffee stand smiled when she recognized me. Little things, but they mattered. Instead of wondering what we'd do each day, we simply lived. Some mornings we'd stop by the market. Other afternoons we'd run errands, pay a bill, pick up groceries, grab fresh bread, come home tired, and laugh because we'd forgotten one thing we actually needed. The vacation feeling had disappeared, and honestly, I was grateful it had, because this finally felt like home, and somehow those became my favorite memories. One afternoon, she was inside talking with her sister. I was sitting alone on the porch. Children were playing across the street. An older man rode past on a bicycle and waved. Without even thinking, I waved back. He smiled, like we'd known each other for years. That's when something hit me. Not all at once. More like a quiet realization that had been building for months. I wasn't counting how many days I had left before flying home. I was counting how many days I had before I'd have to leave. That thought stayed with me every single day. One evening, after dinner, we were sitting outside watching the sky slowly turn orange. She leaned over and asked, "What are you thinking about?" I looked at her, and for the first time, I answered honestly, "I'm tired of saying goodbye." That was the first time I admitted something to her that I'd barely admitted to myself. She reached over, took my hand, and squeezed it gently. Neither of us said another word. We didn't need to. That night, I barely slept. Not because something was wrong, because my mind wouldn't stop asking me one question. Why am I working so hard to bring her into my world when the life I want is already here? The next morning, I made coffee before she woke up. I sat outside in the same chair, watching the neighborhood come alive again. And for the first time, I wasn't thinking about how beautiful the Philippines was. I was thinking about my house back in America, the empty living room, the garage full of things I hadn't touched in years, closets packed with boxes I couldn't even remember packing, a truck that mostly sat in the driveway, a lawn that needed mowing every week. I asked myself something that honestly made me uncomfortable. If all of those things disappeared tomorrow, what would I actually miss? The answer came much faster than I expected. And once it did, there wasn't any way to ignore it. The answer surprised me. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the truck. It wasn't the furniture. The things I cared about most weren't sitting inside that house anymore. They were sitting beside me, sharing coffee every morning, laughing at dinner, planning weekends, building memories that couldn't fit inside a moving box. I think that was the moment my future quietly changed. Not because I decided to move that day, but because, for the first time, I allowed myself to imagine that maybe I didn't have to keep living two separate lives. I wish I could tell you the decision happened overnight. It didn't. Some days, I was completely certain. Other days, I wondered if I'd lost my mind. How do you walk away from a house, a career, a lifetime of memories because of a feeling? I didn't have that answer yet, but I knew I couldn't stop asking myself the question. A few weeks later, I was back home. Same driveway, same mailbox, same house I'd walked into thousands of times before. Nothing had changed. At least, nothing on the outside. Inside, everything felt different. I set my suitcase down by the bedroom door and just stood there. The silence was almost overwhelming. For years, this house had been the center of my life. Now, It just felt like a place where my things lived. I tried to settle back into my routine. I'd mow the lawn, go to the grocery store, meet a friend for lunch every now and then, watch television in the evenings. On paper, from the outside, nothing had changed. But something inside me had changed. Every ordinary day, I caught myself thinking about another ordinary day on the other side of the world. I missed our morning coffee. I missed hearing her laugh from the kitchen. I missed walking to the local market together. I even missed the little things that used to make me smile, like her reminding me not to buy snacks we'd never finish. She was usually right about that. One Saturday, I opened the garage to grab a tool. Instead, I found myself just standing there. Shelves full of boxes, old camping gear, fishing poles I hadn't touched in years, Christmas decorations I'd been moving from one house to another for decades. I couldn't remember the last time I'd actually used half of it. That's when I realized, somewhere along the way, I'd confused owning things with building a life. Those weren't the same thing. The next weekend, I cleaned out one shelf, then another. I donated a few boxes, sold a couple of things online, not because I had made some huge decision. It just felt like the right thing to do. A month later, I noticed something strange. The more I let go, the lighter I felt. Every box that left the garage felt like one less reason to stay where I was. I still hadn't told anyone what I was thinking. Apparently, I wasn't hiding it as well as I thought. A couple of friends noticed. One of them asked me over lunch, "So, when's your next trip?" I smiled. "I don't think there'll be a next trip." He looked confused. "What do you mean?" I just smiled. "I think I'm moving." Not even her. Because saying it out loud would make it real. Then one evening, during one of our video calls, she looked at me and smiled. "You've been quiet lately." I laughed. "I've been thinking." She waited. She never rushed me. That was one of the things I loved most about her. Finally, I looked into the camera and said the words that had been living in my head for weeks. Finally, I looked into the camera and said the words that had been living in my head for weeks. What would you think if I moved there instead? For a second, I honestly thought I'd said too much. She didn't answer right away. She just stared at me. Then, very softly, she asked, "Are you serious?" I nodded. "I think I've been trying to build the wrong future." The smile that came across her face is something I'll never forget. Not because she was excited, because I could see she understood exactly how much that question had cost me. We didn't spend the next hour celebrating. We spent it talking about what every day would actually look like. Could we actually make it work? Where would we live? What would my budget look like? Would I miss home? What about health care? What if I hated living there after 6 months? Those weren't easy conversations. They were honest conversations. And somehow, they made me even more certain. Over the next several months, I made one decision at a time. I met with a realtor, sold my truck. The man buying it asked, "So what are you replacing it with?" I smiled. "A plane ticket." He laughed. I wasn't joking. Held a garage sale. Donated furniture to people who needed it more than I did. Every item that left the house represented another chapter of my life. Some were surprisingly easy to let go. Others weren't. The very last thing I packed was a small photo album. Pictures of my parents, my children growing up, family vacations, birthdays, Christmas mornings. I sat on the living room floor, looking through every page. Then I closed it, placed it carefully into my suitcase, and smiled. Because I finally understood something. Home was never inside those walls. Home was always the people I carried with me. About 4 months later, I was standing in an airport again. It wasn't until the plane lifted off that everything finally felt real. Only this time, I wasn't wondering when I'd be back. I had already said my goodbyes. A lifetime of possessions had been reduced to a few suitcases. If someone had told me a year earlier that everything I truly needed would fit inside them, I would have thought they were crazy. Maybe I would have been right. Or maybe it just takes meeting the right person to realize how little you actually need. The flight felt different this time. There wasn't any nervous excitement, no wondering if we'd get along in person, no worrying about first impressions. This time, I was simply going home. That still feels strange to say, even now. She was waiting for me outside the airport, just like she'd been before. Only this time, neither of us had to think about when I'd be leaving. There wasn't a return ticket folded inside my passport. There wasn't a countdown hanging over us. For the first time, our future wasn't measured in weeks. It was measured in possibilities. The first few weeks weren't glamorous. We rented a small house together, nothing fancy. A place that felt like a blank page. A kitchen we could slowly fill with things we both picked out. A living room with more empty space than furniture. One bedroom, one bathroom. A couple of plastic chairs on the porch. It was simple, but somehow it felt like more of a home than the house I'd left behind. We laughed the first time we went shopping for dishes, trying to decide which plates we actually needed, arguing over coffee mugs, realizing neither of us remembered to buy a can opener. Those little moments, they're the ones I treasure now. Not because they were exciting, because they were ours. People sometimes imagine that moving to another country means every day feels like a vacation. It doesn't. Real life still shows up. The power goes out once in a while. The internet decides today's a good day to be slow. You stand in line to pay bills. You wait for paperwork. You learn patience all over again. Trust me, I learned patience. There were things I missed. I'd be lying if I said otherwise. I missed my kids. I missed a few favorite restaurants. I missed driving familiar roads with the windows down on a cool autumn afternoon. Every now and then, I'd hear an old country song, and suddenly I'd be thinking about places I hadn't seen in years. Homesickness doesn't disappear just because you're happy. Sometimes the two exist at the same time. But every time I started wondering whether I'd made the right decision, something small would happen. She'd walk into the kitchen while I was making coffee and wrap her arms around me without saying a word. We'd take an evening walk after dinner. Her nieces and nephews would run over, yelling my name before I even reached the gate. A neighbor would wave as we passed by. Someone would hand me a fresh mango they'd just picked from their yard. Nothing was perfect. It was simply full. One evening, I realized something. For nearly 3 years, every goodbye had hurt. Now, without even noticing, goodbye had quietly disappeared from our relationship. We didn't have to count the days anymore. We just had to decide what we wanted to cook for dinner. It turns out that's exactly the kind of life I'd been hoping for all along. About 6 months after I moved, my daughter came to visit. She'd been supportive from the beginning, but I also knew she worried about me. Any good daughter would. She wanted to see where I lived, meet the woman she'd spent years hearing about through a phone screen, see for herself whether everything I'd been telling her was actually true. The funny thing is, we didn't do anything special while she was here. There were no expensive resorts, no packed vacation schedule. We just lived. She came with us to the market. We cooked dinner together, walked around the neighborhood in the evenings, sat outside drinking coffee in the mornings. She met our neighbors, laughed with the kids playing outside, watched how naturally we had settled into everyday life. One afternoon, she quietly walked over while I was watering a few plants in the yard. She stood beside me for a moment without saying anything. Then she smiled. "Dad, you're happier than I've seen you in years." I looked over at her. "What do you mean?" She shrugged. "I thought you were giving up your life." She looked around the yard, then back at me. "You weren't. You were building a new one." I'll be honest, those words stayed with me because for a long time, part of me wondered if everyone back home thought I'd simply walked away from everything I'd worked for. Maybe, from the outside, it looked that way, but that's never how it felt. People sometimes ask if I miss America. Of course I do. It's where I grew up. It's where I became a husband, a father. It's where so many of my memories were made. You don't stop loving a place just because you choose to live somewhere else. I still miss family dinners. I miss watching the leaves change in the fall. I miss a few foods I still haven't been able to replace. Some memories will always belong there, and I'm thankful for every one of them. But life has a funny way of surprising you. Sometimes the chapter you think is your last turns out to be the beginning of something you never expected. At 68, I thought I'd already lived the biggest adventure of my life. I was wrong. The biggest one didn't begin with selling my house. It didn't begin with boarding an airplane. It didn't even begin with moving to the Philippines. It began the day I answered a simple comment from someone I'd never met. A conversation became a friendship. A friendship became love. And that love became the courage to completely change my life. People still ask me if I regret selling everything. I always smile, because the question assumes I gave something up. The truth is, I traded one life for another. I didn't lose my memories. I didn't lose my family. I didn't lose the person I'd spent decades becoming. I simply chose where I wanted to spend the years I still had left. Every morning, I still wake up before she does. I still make 2 cups of coffee. I still step outside while the neighborhood slowly comes to life. Sometimes I'll hear roosters. Sometimes it's rain falling on the roof. Sometimes it's children laughing somewhere down the road. A few minutes later, I hear the front door open. She walks outside, still a little sleepy, smiles at me, and takes the 2nd cup of coffee from my hand. No phone screen, no airport goodbyes, no countdown until the next visit. Just another quiet morning with the woman I spent years hoping I'd someday wake up beside. If there's one thing this journey taught me, it's that you're never too old to begin the life you've been dreaming about. And every single morning, when she smiles and says, "Good morning," I know I made the right decision.